Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to friends who are in non-East Coast time zones. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mark Huelsman. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the Hope Center for Student Basic Needs at Temple University, and just want to thank everyone for joining this information session on the FY26 Basic Needs Grant, especially on relatively short notice. Um, if you're here, you likely know that the Department of Labor, in conjunction with the Department of Education, has released the grant application for this year's Basic Needs Grant, along with several other grants within the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education. And we and several really amazing colleagues and partners are very excited to host this session to help walk through a little bit about what we know about this year's competition, how it's similar and distinct from previous competitions. Um, and provide some sort of actionable information as different organizations or institutions or consortia are thinking about applying. So before we kick off, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge off the bat a real gratitude for all the advocates out there who really helped push for this to even be possible this fiscal year. We won't spend too much time on this, but there was a question about whether this grant would be fielded at all. In fact, the last year the administration decided to repurpose and shift what's called FIPSI funding to a handful of separate priorities before Congress both restored and required these grants to be used towards their intended purpose. And in this case, ensuring campuses have the resources to systemically address the basic needs of their students. So with us to talk through and demystify that process. I have four amazing colleagues. I will be sort of our cruise director for the day, and we want to keep it actionable and conversational. But first, we'll kick off with a little bit of a history lesson from my colleague, Bryce McKibben, who's the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy here at the Hope Center. We have Amanda Miller, who's the President of 7th Street Strategies and formerly of the Department of Education, to talk through a little bit about this year's application and the sort of distinctions within it. We have Jose Miranda, the Senior Director of Federal External Affairs at the Institute for College Access and Success, or TICAS, and Jonathan Elkin, who's the Director of Government Relations at the Association of Community College Trustees. So I'm going to get out of our way very quickly, but just in terms of our agenda for today, like I said, we'll go through a little bit of overview and history, some basics on what we know and what's publicly available about this year's competition, some historically promising examples and strategies, as well as kind of the policy context that all of this is sitting in, the other FIPSI grants, where Congress is at in terms of funding these programs in the short and long term, as well as provide any resources or information for folks thinking about applying, as well as provide some, again, as actionable as possible Q&A. Last little bit of housekeeping. You should be able to use the Q&A function in your Zoom browser. Please use that for any questions. I or we will be monitoring on our end and answering what we can. Very clearly, and I want to express that you have the option to submit a question anonymously, if that's important to you, or if you feel like your question may be sensitive in any way. We'll also caveat this with the fact that we cannot know exactly what the administration is going to or how they're going to assess proposals, and we are largely working from publicly available information and what we know from experience, which is just to say that some things we may not be able to be hyper specific or with deep certainty on, but as ever, our goal is to be useful, actionable, and as comprehensive as we can be. So, with that, I really don't want to spend too much time on leveling the problem, because if you're here for the basic needs grant, you probably know that basic needs insecurity is a persistent challenge and crisis on many campuses across the country. Our survey and many others finds that most students, in our case 3 and 5, experience basic needs insecurity related to food or housing. Obviously, these numbers are not just sort of a modern issue. They've been true for as long as we and others have been measuring this issue. But just to say that the urgency of something like federal support for systemic, holistic supports on campus to address basic needs is as urgent as ever and has been urgent for a very long time. Um, and I say this as well to talk about the fact that many and many of you who work on campuses know that basic needs insecurity is a compounding problem, right? We know that, students can go to financial aid, can tap financial aid, but often that, grant aid does not cover the full cost of attendance, that non-tuition costs are, fluctuate within the semester, within the year, within the month, right? In many cases, unexpected expenses arise. Students report running out of money many times during the year, and facing sort of interlocking challenges. Students impacting or who are impacted by basic needs insecurity and food and housing insecurity in particular are also experiencing other forms of material and maybe what we think of as non-material basic needs challenges as well, especially in the areas of mental health. And often, as we know, the limited resources that are available to many other folks out there in terms of our existing but somewhat threadbare safety net are often not available to students or not very easy for students to access and apply. So that just speaks to the urgency of this funding, the continued fight to expand and increase what we know works on campus, and evaluate and continue to flood the zone with as many interventions as possible on campus. So we're really excited always about the potential of this grant, and what may be done in this year's competition to set us on a pathway to reducing it population wide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bryce McKibben to talk a little bit about the history of the grant, where we are, and sort of funding and timing.
Thanks, Mark, and glad to be with you all today. Thanks for attending this webinar. The Basic Needs Grant has been around since fiscal year 2021. So we are about to enter the 5th competitive grant cycle for this program. It took a hiatus in fiscal year 2025 due to a decision by the current administration not to award funds to the FIPSI programs as directed by Congress, a decision which we critiqued at the time, and we are happy that Congress stepped in and reversed or set on a better path for fiscal year 2026 by requiring the programs as listed by Congress to be spent. In 2021, I should talk about the FIPSI programs, the Fund for Improvement in Postsecondary Programs. There was a grab bag of them that were attached to the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, which is also the same bill that enacted the FAFSA Simplification Act and a bunch of COVID-era relief that was moving through Congress at the time. So in that context, it was born out of sort of pandemic era assistance for students and an increased focus on how the basic needs and security of students was directly impacting their ability to stay enrolled and complete their degrees, particularly during a time of incredible upheaval occurring on our college campuses. But the program has evolved since then because, of course, basic needs and security was not just a function of the pandemic. It both predated it, was exacerbated by it, and continues to exist on our campuses. The program started pretty small. In the first year, in 2021, there was only $5 million allocated to the program by Congress. Now it is up to $10 million. We now have a total of 22 states and Puerto Rico that have been awarded grants from the FIPSI program. And the department had, I think in the last competition, which was conducted in fiscal year 2024, 11 new awards were made for the program. I should clarify that the funding for this program is actually available for up to 4 years, not or I believe 48 months, if I'm not mistaken here. Although there are quite a few other programs across ed that are only 3 years in length. So we'll just note that when we send the follow-up here. So the funding, the $10 million available to institutions, the Department of Ed will make awards within that pot of $10 million that will continue on then for the colleges for their full 4-year grant period. So it's not like some other programs operate where in order to get a continuation grant or to have subsequent funding for additional years, that it's dependent on Congress. These grants should be awarded at the beginning, and then colleges draw down over the 4-year period. We're really excited about this year that the grant has come back to life, so to speak. So just to sort of emphasize that context, to Congress, as I mentioned before, mandated that in fiscal year 2026, the Department of Education needed to fund the FIPSI programs that are were specified by Congress. So you might hear it throughout this presentation. Some of the other ones that have launched in this context, other FIPSI programs include the Centers of Excellence for Veteran Student Success, or SEVIS program, depending on how you say it, an HBCU and Tribal College Research and Development infrastructure grant, an open textbook pilot, a rural post-secondary and economic development grant, a transitioning gang-involved youth to higher ed program, and a still to be announced post-secondary student success grant, or PSSG program. We've talked about in other webinars and in other materials from the Hope Center that some of these grants do include other kinds of basic needs aligned functions or topics. So, for example, because basic needs investments help students complete their degrees, some of the post-secondary student success grant work has encompassed basic needs work, and we've seen some of the rural colleges do that in their RPED grants there, as well. So this webinar is going to be focused on the basic needs grant, but I did want to mention in the larger context that we're operating, there are several open competitions that the basic needs grant is happening concurrently, and all of those applications are due on June 23rd. As far as we know, the post-secondary student success grant, or PSSG, may be a little bit later. And I think that covers pretty much the larger context of where we're at here. To go into more of the specifics of what actually is in this year's grant application, as Mark said, we're very, very happy to have Amanda Miller, who we've worked with a long time in her role, both at the Department of Ed, formerly under the previous administration, and now in her role at 7th Street Strategies. So Amanda, if it's all right, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for showing up on short notice. So a couple of things, as Bryce and Mark mentioned, I oversaw this program. I don't know if you can, I see a black box, but I don't know if other people, that's just me. Okay, there we go. It was just me, sorry. I oversaw this program at the Department of Ed in the Biden administration, and so have been tracking these programs closely. And I'm hoping that you will leave today, at least from my part of the presentation, with two things. One is wanting to apply for this grant if it makes sense for you, and not feeling like it's scary or you shouldn't apply or there's something new that is going to change the structure of the program dramatically. But also that you have what you need to sort of make a decision and assess your risk. Generally, grants are have taken a different turn in their predictability and some of their structure, so that you have the tools you need to make that decision. So just I thought I would sort of frame it as kind of what hasn't changed and then what has changed. So the main thing that has not changed is this is still a basic needs grant program. And so Congress sets the parameters for the grant program. It's a grant program designed, as stated in the introduction of the NIA, to advance solutions to identify, address, and prevent student basic needs insecurity. There's no new definition to that. They don't explain that. So we all know what that means. But the legislation, which Bryce mentioned, this year did incorporate Congress's intent, does have what Congress intended it to be and references back to that description. And it is talked about in the same way it's always been talked about, which is, again, a program to advance systemic solutions to identify, address, and prevent student basic needs insecurity, and lays out in that language establishing processes to identify and conduct outreach to students who are eligible for public and tax benefit programs, conducting surveys or assessments of student basic needs security, including surveys of student needs conducted upon enrollment, providing referrals or case management to students to enroll in federal public and tax benefit programs, or coordinating and collaborating with government and community-based organizations to execute these activities. And it also specifically talks about activities that we all think about as basic needs, like housing, free or subsidized food, child care, financial aid, emergency financial aid, and mental and behavioral health services. So those are all in the statute. That is the intent of the program. That is still the structure of the program. So that has not changed. The next thing that hasn't changed is who could apply. So eligible applicants still include colleges, consortia of colleges, nonprofit, or sorry, I'm not aligned with the slides, nonprofit or state agencies. And all of those entities could still apply. So as a college or as a nonprofit, you are still able to apply on your own. Um, what we don't think has changed, although we are waiting for some more information. So I do anticipate they've basically announced these competitions, and then about 2 weeks later, they do a webinar that tells you what you need to know, which is why the Hope Center is doing this 2 weeks earlier. And they also usually issue FAQs closer to the time of the deadline, but we can be helpful in trying to get some of these answers. But we don't anticipate that what is allowable to spend your money on and what you can't spend money on will change. There are no specific regulations around this program. So the general Department of Education regulations apply, which means you still can't spend money on things like construction. But you could spend money on things that are allowable, reasonable, and allocable to the grant. Um, what also hasn't changed is the level of evidence that's required for the application. So it still requires you to demonstrate a rationale, which means that your application has to have citations of high quality research that suggests that the project components you're describing will likely significantly improve the outcomes that you're proposing. Um, and the performance measures haven't changed, which is actually very important because these are the things that you will have to report on to show that you're doing your grant successfully. And these are all around still the percentage of low-income students that you're serving with this grant, how many students are completing, measuring basic needs in security, and how that's being addressed. So the grant itself, the meat of the grant is still how it always has been. Um, the other thing is Bryce mentioned is that it's federally, it's still forward funded, which means you will apply and likely get all your 4 years of funding in one time, which is good news because you're not dependent. They can always terminate it, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they cannot, you're not required to apply every year for it to be continued. So those things haven't changed, but there are some things that are new. So the thing that's most new that I think has caught two things that have caught people's attention and I think maybe have been a little more concerning to people of whether or not they can still apply with the projects they've been planning. One is sort of this narrative that's in the application around workforce outcomes and AI. Um, and so what's important to note is there is that language in the introduction of the grant in their narrative. There is that language in the invitational priority around work-based learning. But the invitational priorities, as you know, if you've applied, don't count for anything in your scoring of your grant. So it's things that they are looking for in the narrative, and it's important to include, and I'll explain why in a minute, why it's important to include, but it hasn't again changed what you can propose and how they're going to score your application. And there's equally one around basic needs such as housing, childcare, emergency aid, and one around what they view as basic needs of AI and workforce Pell and apprenticeships. And so again, it's something that you should think about in the narrative, but not anything different. If you are working towards post-secondary student success by providing these supports or connecting students to these supports, then you are doing that in a way that was setting them up to be successful, whether they're entering a workforce on a workforce pathway or a further degree and continuing their education. So none of that has changed. The other thing that's new is there's a new incentive for state agencies to be the applicant and be the lead folks sort of running the program. And that includes SEAs, workforce agencies, SHIOs, or Indian tribes. One within only one of those four entities can be designated within each state. If they are the lead applicant running the program, they will get an extra 10 points of competitive preference points. So they have an advantage, but again, doesn't mean you still can't apply as a college. So something to factor in. But the other thing to also remember is that the states can subgrant to colleges. And so the state can be the lead applicant, but if you had a grant before, you could, partner with your state and be a subgrantee to still make sure that your students are getting the services and that you're able to contribute to the work. So developing that relationship with one of those state entities is important. Um, we talked a little bit quickly about the invitational priorities, which are new, but again, that should help think about the framing of your grant, but does not impact the score. Um, The next thing that's new are some of the selection, there's some changes in the selection criteria. So that's really the meat of what you get your points on. So in this grant, usually you'll see an absolute priority, which means you have to do these things, a competitive preference priority, which means you get these points, and a invitational priority, which means we would like to see this in your grant and in what you're going to do. So there is no absolute priority, which is a little bit strange here, but again, goes back to that this grant is still the same. It is what is in the report language from the Senate, and it is still the grant, the meat of the grant program that you have all been familiar with. The selection criteria has changed a little bit. Some of it is the same. Not surprisingly, they took out some of the language around targeted populations, both of who you are serving and who works for the program. So there used to be some language around making sure that you're serving and that your staff is representing underrepresented targeted populations. That language is not in there anymore. There's some new language about making sure you're using and providing data for continuous improvement and in order to scale the program. So that's something you'd want to include. And then there's some new language in the selection criteria around project evaluation and evidence building. So that's something, again, you'd want to make sure you're including in your narrative. And then the last thing or the next thing, there's a couple more, sorry. Next thing that's new is there's a new tiebreaker. Often we get really great applicants, and they are often, there are often a lot of applicants who, when they're scored, get the same score. And so there's three tiebreakers this year. The first, they're looking at schools or applicants that serve the highest number of Pell students, which is great and goes to the intent of the program. The second is consistent with what they've been trying to do in a lot of different ways. It is incentivizing you to propose lower indirect costs. They can't just change your indirect cost rate. That was, they tried and they weren't able to do that. So now they're incentivizing that in when they look at the tiebreaker. And then the third is looking for geographic diversity in terms of the applications. If they get to, they don't always get to the third tiebreaker, but that's the thing that they will look at next. Um, just a couple other things, Bryce will cut, or Mark will cut me off if I'm going too long, but that are a little bit different. One is for those of you who have applied before, you'd be used to seeing a doc, and I'm getting a little weedy, but I think hopefully if you're getting ready to apply, it's helpful. You're used to seeing something called the GEPA document, and you had to address what was called Section 427 in GEPA, which is a statutory requirement that shows how your grant is going to target a certain population for equity purposes. That is still in statute and still required. But instead of having that as a separate part of the application throughout all of their grants, what this administration is doing is on your application, you'll see a little box that says, are you going to be compliant with these equity provisions? And you check yes or no. And then you reference the pages in your application where you talk about that. So if you were talking about how, you're supporting rural students, for example, you would reference the part of the narrative, but it's no longer a separate form. So for those of you who have applied for grants before, you'll notice there used to be four pretty intense questions that took up a lot of time to address this. That form is no longer part of the application. The timeline is different. These are due June 23rd, which is soon. And all of the FIPSI grants are due that soon. And then the last thing that I would say are different that is just the terms and conditions. And this is what we're seeing in all the grants. I'm happy to talk about it more, but just to make sure that you are looking at the terms and conditions carefully and understanding what a lot of it is designed. A lot of it isn't changes and some of the language is just changed, but some of it is changed. And so it just increases your risk for the grants being canceled or being looked at more carefully for certain activities. And so you just want to make sure you and your council know what you're agreeing to and do a risk analysis and assessment within your own institution or nonprofit to make sure that you can apply comfortably for that. And happy to also talk about all of that offline. So that's a lot. I think that's it. But again, I will just leave you with all of this seems like a lot, but you should apply. This is money that Congress wants your students to be benefit from. And there's some good things I think about looking at some of these approaches the way they are. Some of it seems new, but the bulk of it is the same. And so hopefully, you decide the risk is worth it and that you can still apply and serve your students with these funds. And I'll turn it back to Mark.
Thank you, Amanda. That was incredibly comprehensive, and apologies for toggling back and forth between slides. You were way more ahead of us in that, and way more comprehensive than we were in the slides. So I super appreciate that. We have a few questions in the chat. I'm going to hold for some of them, but just know that we'll try to answer ones that are sort of grouped thematically towards the end, or maybe answered in the next few little summaries here. So stay tuned. Next, we want to go to Jose, who is going to chat a little bit about what we know from the past, to the extent that past is prologue on any of this. As Amanda said, many of the sort of bones and fundamentals of this grant are the same, right? And so what we know from past grantees, promising strategies, and where folks might go in this year's application. So, Jose, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. And yeah, just a quick recap again. We know we've had this funding for 4 full cycles up until FY24, about 42 grantees in total. And just like Amanda said, just like Mark said, everything that has been done that has proven to be effective in these last 4 cycles are good starting points, I would say, to think through what you could apply, what you could submit. Of course, changing the narrative to also embed into those ideas some of that narrative that the administration is looking this time around workforce development, workforce readiness, and so forth. The first year that the grant launched, when we only had 6 awards, a lot of them focus on what I call more direct service oriented activities, food pantries, and so forth. Going beyond that into the last 3, we really looked at, or the administration rather, really prioritized looking at basic needs from a systemic approach, and how do we address basic needs systemically within the institution, within the student body. And so a couple of examples that proved really effective, where some of the grantees created what they called basic need hubs, where they centralized locations where students could find multiple services. They could find emergency aid, they could find food assistance, they could find technology assistance, whether it's computer loaning or tablets and so forth. Um, that helped greatly navigate the burden of students having to navigate a maze of different places and locations and people to find what they needed in order to stay enrolled. Amanda mentioned health and mental health explicitly, and that was another area where we saw great success from some past grantees. For example, Passaic County Community College in New Jersey launched a peer leadership program using these funds, where they even included some stipends for wellness training for students who were going through mental health issues or struggling as they stayed enrolled in school. Other examples were Pueblo Community College in Colorado, who were able to hire a therapist for their existing campus clinic to help with mental health issues in their student body. But beyond looking at that, there's a couple of other things that looking at data and outcomes that proved effective was also looking at how grantees leverage these funds to partner with community-based organizations, to partner with local government to serve as connectors for students. Maybe it was services that the institutions themselves could not offer, but they could serve as the partner to connect them to, for example, if there's a student facing food insecurity, they could get connected to the local SNAP office. If they had transportation issues, that they could be connected to the local transportation authority for discounted passes, and so forth. And then the other thing that I just want to flag too is that as grantees looked at the different proposals that they're submitting, they're also looking at how addressing student basic needs also helped impact retention, persistence, and belonging for students. An example there is Virginia Commonwealth University, where 90% of the students served under their grant in the surveys that they received indicated that they improved their sense of belonging on the university, which in turn made them more likely to stay and persist through their higher education. Another example was Hartnell Community College in California, where, as an example, students that were served through the grant, their persistence rate was 87% compared to the overall student population, where it was only 65%. So, systemically looking at how these resources help students feel more connected to the institutions, which in turn makes it less likely for them to stop out, and then how it helps them ensure that potential barriers that would have forced them to stop out are no longer an issue, whether it's transportation, childcare, food insecurity, technology. And as we know, more and more technology continues to be a bigger factor in higher education. The administration is in their narrative included AI. So how does you addressing technology gaps for your students can help push that narrative? This is some of the areas where you can think through as you create your competition. I'm going to drop a report that Tikas wrote last fall on the program specifically. If you go through it, it's pretty lengthy, but if you go through pages 6 through 9, there's actually a whole lot of different examples of different grantees, what they used the funds for, and how it proved effective for their students. So with that, I'll turn it back to Mark.
Thank you, Jose, and thanks for dropping that really great TICAS report in the chat. Going through how institutions were sort of managing this funding and what they were using it for, and sort of taking a qualitative approach is really really great. As mentioned, we have a lot of questions coming in, which is really great. I'm starting to, in my head, group them thematically, but I do want to turn it over to Jonathan to talk a little bit about this grant in the context of the overall policy environment. Obviously, this competition is for FY 2026. We are in the throes of, or Congress is in the throes of creating their FY27 appropriations legislation. So what we know about sort of this stuff moving forward, the context all of this is sitting in, maybe a little bit about the other FIPSI grants here and there. And anything from the sort of community college perspective. So take it away, Jonathan.
Sure, happy to. Thanks again for the invite. So yeah, it's a tough climate now, right? So a lot of these FIPSI competitions did not go out last year as originally intended, but instead the administration changed them to do different priorities. This year, with the FY26 final bill, Congress put in some more specific guardrails to ensure that Congress's priorities would have sway, and that these specific competitions would go out as Congress intended. So that is why we are seeing this specific competition for basic needs grant, as well as the other ones in the FIPSI bucket that Congress specifically said, we are doing these things. We are doing rural post-secondary ed, and you must do that competition this year. So that is encouraging. I will say that to continue building long-term support for FIPSI and this program, Basic Needs in particular, it's important to talk to your members of Congress. And one easy way that you can do that without lobbying is, as you are applying, you can ask your congressional offices for a formal letter of support for your application. And this is a constituent service that all members of Congress do. You can submit it oftentimes in the same form on a congressional website as you would if you're asking to have a flag flying over the Capitol or to get help with your veterans benefits. This is a constituent service that all members of Congress offer, which is to often do a letter of support for your competitive grant application. And of course, in the short term, that might help. It's not written down anywhere that is going to be a tiebreaker between two identically scoring competitive grant applications, but that's the short term. In the long run, what that also does is show your members of Congress that, okay, there are only 10 winners this year, right? But there are hundreds that are applying. And so they will have a sense of how great the need is for this as they work on allocating appropriations for FY27 and beyond. So that is one thing you can do. And then, of course, we would love to continue partnering on long-term advocacy for this program as Congress writes the appropriations bills. So I'll give you that. And then just one last thing for community colleges specifically. If you thought Amanda was really insightful and experienced as previous deputy assistant secretary for post-secondary education programs and in her role advising on grants, well, guess what? Tomorrow, Association of Community College Trustees is going to be hosting yet another webinar featuring Amanda, talking about this as well as a wide variety of additional programs that community colleges are eligible to apply for. So I will put that in the chat. And if you haven't already registered, please, community college colleagues, we'll see you again tomorrow.
Thanks, Jonathan. I feel like it's a music festival situation where we've got opening acts, although Amanda's just, playing the opener and the main stage. Thanks, Jonathan, for all of that. I think we have a couple sort of ways we can go about this, and I'll sort of take moderator's prerogative here. I think we have some questions in the chat about sort of the nuts and bolts and resources that would be good for folks to think about as they're considering applications. So I think there's one sort of group of questions that I'd actually like to throw out to the group, and anyone can answer it. One thing that is sort of distinct this year is the competitive priority being placed for applications that are led by a state entity, right? Which Amanda talked quite a bit about. In terms of sort of how folks should think about partnering with state agencies. I know, Amanda, you mentioned sort of building relationships and thinking about having it be led through existing relationships with state agencies, whether it's a state higher ed agency or another state workforce board or anything like that. How folks should think about that, maybe some sort of like actionable advice there, and in terms of how we think the applications are going to be scored if there's tiebreakers around the percent of Pell eligible students, but if this is a broader consortium led by states as opposed to institutions themselves, how are we thinking about that sort of angle here? If anyone wants to take that.
Sure. And also I'm some of the questions I'm just responding to in the chat as well, just because I know we have limited time. So how people should think about partnering with their state entity and how they will address them in tiebreakers. My multitasking is pretty good, but
You're doing
not
great.
perfect.
Yeah.
So now I feel all this pressure because I'm like pitched for like a follow-up. Now, if no one shows up tomorrow, I'll take it personally. So in terms of partnering with this state, I mean, this is something I've been talking about since last year when we saw the priorities. The good thing about the Department of Ed having to do rulemaking for their priorities and they're public and they go through a process is we sort of know what to expect. So I know it's a short time so this advice will be for this one, but also for future grants, because this is going to continue. Every administration does rulemaking, sets their priorities, and then incorporates them into their grants. And so generally, because of this priority that they have called returning education to the states, the way they've been doing that in grant programs is a couple ways. Where states are allowed to apply, they've been incentivizing the state agency to be the applicant, either through giving them more money or competitive preference points, like we're seeing this one. Where they're not allowed to apply, we're still seeing like in order to get preference points, you have to get a letter of support from your governor or your state head, your SHIA or your workforce agency. So generally, this is a good time for future grants to be able to build those relationships with your state agencies, let them know about your projects, think about ways to collaborate. So that would be my general answer. For this specifically, which is for 2 weeks, I think, hopefully hopefully you have those relationships. And again, the state can apply on their own, but they're also allowed to have sub-grantees. And so, there may be a way that makes sense in your state with the SHIA or with your workforce board or the SEA to be the sub-grantee to do certain parts of this work. If that's something you're interested in, the SHIA may be able to run the program, but they may not have the same capacity to do the day-to-day. So they're going to need to rely on the colleges who have that experience. And then I think your second question was on the tiebreaker with the Pell states. Yeah. So they will look at who you're serving. So even state entities will have to talk about who they're serving. So they will use it that way. So it doesn't have to be, I think the way the tiebreaker language is written is serving Pell students, not that the program, the grant, the funds would serve the highest level of Pell students, not that your school has the highest level of Pell Grant students. So I think that's how they'll get to that.
Thanks, Amanda. That's and super great questions about how, again, a grant that was sort of institution focused might have to zoom out a little bit. But, as Amanda mentioned, there's sort of, sub-granting and sort of consortia approaches that I think folks can take.
Mark,
Bryce, do
if
you
you're
want, I
okay.
know you wanted to answer this question live in the Q&A. So do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I just want to also mention sort of the context that we're seeing across FIPSI programs, which Amanda also hinted at, right? That we've got the returning education to the state's priorities showing up in some of the other FIPSI competitions that are going on right now. Although they do differ, some of them require, as she said, a lead applicant versus letters of support of them being involved in the project. But one of the Q&A questions is essentially, is it worth it for institutions to apply? If the context of all of the funds are going to go to states. We'll be quite honest, we don't know that there's going to be a significant number of state higher education agencies that are able to turn around an application this quickly. In many ways, institutions are more nimble and able to put together applications, and that's historically been how this is going. We are going to see, where we are seeing all of these FIPSI programs all being having a priority for states landing at the exact same time, and states are going to be in a crunch period. So higher education agencies are probably going to choose, in many cases, between which FIPSI program makes the most sense for them to be involved, if they have capacity at all. So a lot of our lead states who are already very invested in basic needs work may simply say, this is just not something we're able to do in the next 3 weeks before it makes sense. So don't count yourselves out. If you are an individual institution or a consortia, see if your state is, potentially putting in an application, but certainly don't, sort of say that or make a determination just based on the competitive preference priority alone that you wouldn't be eligible, because there may not actually be a sort of glut of states applying. There are also a couple of other entities I think it's important to mention. States are going to be the big one here, but tribes are also eligible to apply, and we don't frequently see a lot of tribal organizations putting in applications, but there is a significant need and disproportionate levels of basic needs and security at our tribal colleges and universities, so they should definitely take a close look at this. And state workforce development agencies are also eligible to apply. So it's kind of come up here, indirectly, but the larger context of there being a sort of additional focus on workforce outcomes and programs in the invitational priority would be that it's important to talk to the workforce agencies in your states to understand if they're maybe thinking about this or would want to think about it in the future. For example, we are in the first year of implementation of the new workforce Pell programs. These are going to be students who are coming in, for very short periods on their college campuses. They have different but similar needs to the students who are enrolled for longer periods, and they may not have the kind of basic needs supports on their campuses or across the state. So one idea for a project could be, a workforce development agency or a state higher education agency thinking about how workforce Pell students could have their basic needs supports met as well. So just kind of tying in, there's a few other agencies to consider here, but plenty of room for institutions and consortia to also apply.
And if I can just add one thing on two quick things on that. One is I would say the competitive preference point is 10 points above the 100 points. So it could also be that the state gets the 10 points but doesn't get all 100, and you can still have more points as a college because there are other factors in that. The other thing, which I think is generally not a good policy, but maybe helps in some of these situations, is they are going to do peer review and peer review panels that they always do to assess the points. They have non-federal peer reviewers to do that. We don't know how many. We used to do 3. It's not required. So in the last FIPSI competition, they just had 1 reviewer for each grant program. But they do say that they will not necessarily, they can award them for different reasons. So they may not award them in rank order. That is not required, which as a policy matter, I don't think is great. But I think that in terms of your question of like sort of it's hard to game the system of knowing whether or not you should apply because we don't know what other factors are going to play into how they select them. So another reason not to get too caught up on the competitive preference priority as you're making that decision.
I'm just
Yeah, and
curious,
go ahead, Jonathan.
as a follow-up, understanding that states may not be nimble enough to put together an application here from scratch, would you advise that individual institutions at least check with their state agencies to see if they're already planning to apply so that they can try to jump in there and be considered as a partner college?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think a college could apply on their own and a state. It doesn't say you could either apply, you might get twice as much support. You might be able to be a subgrantee in a state and get some support then and also win your own grant program. I mean, there's not that many grants, but it's not exclusive. And also you could, you know, your state could get it and a college in your state can get it as well. But it is worth knowing, I think, for the fuller context.
It's a great point, and to marry both Bryce and Amanda's points. Bryce talking about sort of the Amanda, you answered a separate question in the chat about about being intentional about sort of the framing and the wording of the grant application as exists, and addressing what they're looking for and saying. I think Bryce's point around the emphasis on workforce outcomes, the prioritization on workforce Pell, right? I think is very clearly stated in there. So just any way that folks are interested in making those types of connections authentically and in their projects is worth considering at this point. Let me scroll back to the questions here. We have a few more minutes for question. I think one question is around if I can read between it. There's several opportunities and I believe several FIPSI grants. The question is around can schools or organizations apply for more than one opportunity, or pick one and go with it. I don't think there's anything stopping institutions or consortia or states in this case from trying to tailor projects for different federal funding streams. And to that point, I'm saying that because the Hope Center, after this call, we have on our website a guide to federal funding opportunities that either directly or tangentially address student basic needs. So various programs like the Basic Needs Grant that institutions can apply for. We are in the process of updating that, and that will be shared alongside, I believe, the recording of this, and will also be available on our website, hope.temple.edu. So for folks who are interested in other adjacent opportunities, Bryce mentioned several of them that are already out or soon to be out. But there are a handful of opportunities for folks to address this, even if they're not sort of able to crack the nut of the very small but mighty Basic Needs Grant program this time. Go ahead, Jose.
And Mark, if I can just add in real quick there, like unlike the Title III and Title V programs, all the FIPSI programs serve very different purposes. So if your institution has the bandwidth to go after several of those competitions, I would highly encourage you to do so. I mean, there's one that's specific for rural institutions. There's one that's specific to supporting student veterans. There's the open textbook pilot program. So if you are an institution that can meet the qualifications for several of these and you have the bandwidth, I think it's always worth to pursue those federal funds.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more. Um, okay, we have a few more minutes left. It seems that, and I would direct people to the very prolific answering of Q&A that Amanda, Bryce, actually everyone's sort of engaging in answering questions on in the chat itself. I think there's a question around where the grant application sits. So I sent a link to that. We'll obviously be sharing this afterwards. In terms of open questions, there's a couple. One Amanda just mentioned one. There were a couple questions around allowable uses that aren't enumerated in the grant application. Mental health was one of them. I believe there was another question about that. And yeah, Amanda already mentioned this, but the invitational priority doesn't sort of impact allowable uses. And I think some of the language around such as direct services such as food, housing, emergency financial aid. We and I know many others on this call are very focused on the intersection between basic needs and security and things like mental and behavioral health. I don't think that there's anything that would preclude someone from including that in an application, given the sort of obvious importance on basic needs and on sort of workforce readiness, right? So I don't think folks should be discouraged on that front. Um, I want to turn it back to our panelists a little bit. Is there anything else in terms of both sort of resources, context, what folks should be doing and thinking about in their applications or partnerships? Obviously, we have a pretty short time frame here in terms of the application process, but anything we haven't really touched on in terms of what people should be thinking about and maybe sort of some creative strategies they could deploy.
Mark, it's not a new thing, but I just want to re-emphasize what both you and Amanda and Jonathan and Bryce have already said, which is don't look at the new language around workforce development, around AI, around workforce Pell as a deterrent. Just look at it as a creative way to form your narrative, right? If you are going after a basic needs hub. Maybe you incorporate your career advisor into that basic needs hub. If you are trying to address technology gaps within your student population, that is one way to also help students get closer to AI literacy. Just think of it as ways that you can embed the real work you're doing to address the student basic needs issues for the basic needs issues for your students, along with what the administration is trying to prioritize.
Thanks, Jose. Bryce, Amanda, Jonathan, I want to give you a chance to provide sort of final thoughts, advice, resources. I feel like people have some actionable, both in terms of the grant itself and how to think through an application, but also boosting the long-term impact of this program. So thank you, Jonathan, for that. Anything else, sort of as we wrap up here a little bit, in terms of final advice or words of encouragement for folks who are considering this?
I'll very quickly say, since I never miss an opportunity to talk about appropriations, that June is a very busy month for a lot of us who work in higher education policy, and you may see a lot of news that mentions the Basic Needs Grant and FIPSI and other things happening. So just to sort of brace you, but also calm some nerves that, in about a week or so, we will see the release of a House appropriations bill draft for fiscal year 2027. The Senate is likely to follow a couple weeks after. And this will include determinations of whether or not the Basic Needs Grant is to be funded for the next year. There's plenty of things that need to happen before Congress reaches a deal on that don't impact this current fiscal year 2026 competition. So we've got a two-track fight, if you will, right? We've got to make sure that the current grant as it exists is being used in the best way that we as supporters and advocates can possibly help with that. And we have to make sure that we're also advocating for continued funding for this program and increased funding going forward. We've done some sign-on letters there. There are many grantees who've helped in reaching out to their members of Congress. It is entirely possible that we see the House majority again propose to eliminate the Basic Needs Grant for fiscal year 2027. But again, that does not mean the current competition would stop or be affected in any way. So just wanted to elevate that there's going to be a lot of things happening related to higher education and sort of news making over the course of the next couple of weeks. And we know that many of you who are going to be working on applications are just going to have to be sort of heads down, focus on sort of getting this across the finish line in the next 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think look out they likely will have some webinars on this with TA. They're not always posting the slides, so if you can sign up, sign up. Don't wait to start your application until they do the webinar. Do your best you can. For those of you who are new to applying for grants, make sure to not wait till the 23rd to submit it. Make sure to submit it early. Grants.gov often goes down, so just um, a little, but it is a short timeline. I would work with your states and see, explore all the opportunities you can. Again, make sure you're sort of recognizing the kind of new landscape we are in funding and be prepared for that. But the terms and conditions kick in when you accept the grant. So if you're still figuring it out and that's going to take longer, you should apply. And think about the work you're doing. There's work you can do that you may be able to make part of this project that's not part of the funding in your application. Talk about what they're asking you to talk about specifically for the grant funding. And follow the selection criteria to the best that you can. And be intentional about it. But again, it's a tight window and it's a lot of work to apply. So I don't want to minimize that. But we're also really excited that they are actually competing it. And so we want to make sure that people are taking advantage of that. It helps Bryce advocate on the Hill if they get a lot of applications. So good luck.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Jonathan and Jose. Amanda already did this and scooped me, but in terms of where folks can find the work of this group, I know that there's a few questions that have actually just come in terms of like very, very sort of logistical questions, which may be answered on a potential federal webinar on this, but I think we're happy to provide a resource and some historical context. So stay tuned if folks are comfortable putting their contact info in the chat or sharing. We'll obviously connect folks as questions arise. And there's a sprint to about 3.5 weeks, I guess, here to get applications together. So we are committed to being a resource for folks who are trying to think this through. And I really want to thank our panelists for walking through this on again very short notice. Thank you for all of you for being here. And stay tuned. We're happy to share resources and help folks put together the best interventions possible to address student basic needs. So with that, thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for
Thanks,
hosting.
y'all.